The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm Charles Christian and with me is Janie. You're listening to the latest episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show, available both on internet radio and as a podcast on all the usual podcast platforms, including iTunes, YouTube and Spotify. We've got our usual mixture of the paranormal, folklore, the just plain weird. And now here's Janie to talk about St. Clement.
Yes, I expect you'd like to know a little more about St. Clement, wouldn't you?
I would indeed.
Right, well, you're going to, because I have been looking into St. Clement's Day, which is the 23rd of November.
Oh.
And oranges and lemons say the bells of St. Clement's. Have I got that right?
That's it, yes.
Same thing.
Yep.
Right. Well, Clement is generally accepted as St. Peter's third successor as Pope. And was venerated as a martyr in the early Christian church.
They like their martyrs.
Yeah, but actually his martyrdom can't be proved. So the legend is that he was tied to an anchor and thrown into the sea. And then angels were said to have built a very ornate tomb for him on the seabed, which was miraculously uncovered by the sea every year on his day.
Of course.
I don't know how
You don't get me that for my birthday, do you?
No, sadly. I just haven't got the time these days, I'm sorry. The regular appearance of an anchor, you might have noticed in pictures of the saint, was enough to ensure that he was adopted as a patron saint of seafarers, not surprisingly. But, more surprisingly, foundry workers, and most famously, I didn't know this because, of course, obviously, having had a pony, blacksmiths. But, yeah, something to do with, blacksmiths and iron and all that sort of thing. There was also a house visiting custom related to Clement's, and that was mostly carried out by children, and there was a rhyme. And it was recited or sung, and money and food or sweets were expected in return. Plus ça change, always want the sweeties, something in return. Anyway, a Warwickshire version from about 1870 was printed in the Times in 1935.
Took a long time to get Warwickshire.
Yes. You'll be glad to hear it's not long. That's why they didn't. They took such a long time to print it. No, it's quite short. Clementing, once a year. Apples and pears are very good cheer. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, and 3 for him who made us all. Up with the hatchet, and down with the shoe. And if you have no apples, money'll do. Money will do. Money will do. Catchy, eh?
It's catchy.
Yeah, that's all I know about St. Clement's. So
That's probably more than most people know about St. Clement.
or, frankly, could care to know. It's not that fascinating, is it, really?
All those seafarers, they'll be
that's true.
tut-tutting.
Yeah, that's true. Sorry about that, yeah. Okay,
Thank
that's
you.
it. Goodbye. Something wicked this way comes. Weird Harvest Press presents Harvest Hymns, the sweet fruits and twisted roots of folk horror, a 2-volume set of books investigating the music of folk horror, featuring contributions from some of the biggest names in the field: Candia McCormack, Johnny Trunk, Maddie Pryor, Sharon Krause, Jim Jupp and Kemper Norton, to name just a few. Available now via lulu.com. 100% of all Weird Harvest Press profits are donated to wildlife charities.
Welcome, fool. You have come of your own free will to the appointed place. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wicker Man. The Wicker Man.
Well, I didn't think we'd be covering this topic again quite so quickly, but once more we're in the realms of the pop and rock industry and their various conspiracy theories. Latest development, early November in the Sun newspaper. It's a story saying a video clip allegedly shot by LaToya Jackson showing Michael Jackson's tomb at the Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles. Because there is no name written on the tomb, conspiracy theorists are claiming this is because there is no body inside. He's not buried. It doesn't add up, they say. They also add to the fact that his death certificate and other documentation relating to Michael Jackson's name don't match. In some documents, he is described as Joseph, as it is on his death certificate. However, apparently on his passport, he's merely down as Joe. And so the conspiracy theory runs that he's not dead at all, he's still around. Of course, it could just be that there's so much litigation still going surrounding his estate that they haven't got round to doing it. And for the record, according to the Forbes magazine recently, Michael Jackson is the highest paid dead celebrity of 2018. And an item we'll be coming back to shortly, it's also suggested that in an episode of The Simpsons in 1991, it was predicted that Michael Jackson would fake his own death. As we reported earlier, there was a fresh revival of interest in the Paul McCartney is dead conspiracy theory following the release of his latest album, Egypt Station. However, digging around the internet, and this was prompted by one of our listeners asking if there were any rumours about the death of George Harrison. No, sadly, in his case, it just appears to be a nice guy. Had, unfortunately, lots of bad things happen to him. He was stabbed in a home invasion and later died of cancer, but no mystery. Unless you accept another theory that the Beatles never existed at all, and that they were all just actors, clones looking the same, who took the part of the Beatles from the 1960s onwards. There's a Beatles Never Existed website. You can still find it lurking out there at thebeatlesneverexisted.com. And this has lots of photographs claiming to show that the Beatles were four similar looking people, but each character, Ringo, George, John, Paul, were played at different times by different actors, which is why sometimes they look a little bit different. And they have various analysis of photographs, and so they have one picture from 1963 showing Paul looking shorter than John Lennon, and another one from later the same year in which Paul appears to be taller than John Lennon. And there's also pictures of John Lennon, different stages in his career, showing that his eyes are sometimes closer together than they were at other times, and that his pupils don't line up. Sadly, the analysis of the photographs doesn't quite take into account the fact of perspective, and that if you take a picture of four people standing in a line and one of them is closer to the camera than the others, then he'll be taller than the others. And if the camera angle is slightly different and that person is no longer at the front but to the side, then they might just look shorter. As for John Lennon and his eyes, they appeared to overlook the fact that some of the key mystery photographs are the ones where he's wearing spectacles. And any of you who've ever had your photograph taken when you're wearing glasses, you'll know that the lenses distort the image at the other side and that your eyes don't quite line up. Nevertheless, the people behind the Beatles Never Existed website say the research began in 2011, and we came to the conclusion that the musical group known as the Beatles was composed of multiples. How and in what way they were used isn't known, but we were able to see it wasn't actors with cosmetic surgery or human doubles. They then go on to say that due to the fact we've done as much research as possible and there are more current and pressing worldwide issues confronting humanity, and I certainly agree with that, it is time to move on. Thank you for your interest in our work, and we hope it's been a helpful contribution to learning and understanding why the world is in its current condition and one of the major ways in which it got this way. I can't help thinking using doubles for a pop group in the 1960s may not be the end of the world. However, there's an interesting comment to their goodbye message saying, "This just goes to prove that this was a further attempt by," I quote, "the controlled opposition to put out disinformation. All four Beatles were clones is purely to discredit the whole Paul is dead subject. It's to distract people from the Paul is dead theory." So you can't please anybody, can you? Either the Beatles didn't exist or they did exist, and they didn't exist was to distract you from the fact that Paul McCartney was dead. Anyway, I took advantage while I was researching that story to see any other ones, and I found this on the ultimateclassicrock.com website, some fairly crazy conspiracy theories. We mentioned earlier that an episode of The Simpsons was meant to predict that Michael Jackson would fake his own death. There's another similar one that an episode in 2008 apparently predicted the death of the artist Prince. And what else we got? Oh yes, David Bowie apparently predicted the rise of Kanye West. It's on the album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders of Mars, which was in 1972. And the picture shows Bowie standing under a sign in the Covent Garden area of London. And the sign says K West. It's actually initials K. West. And inside the album opening track called 5 Years finds Bowie predicting a grisly end to the world unless a mythical starman descends to save the earth from itself. And guess what? 5 years after the album was released, Kanye West was born. Woo-woo. So, well done, David, for spotting that one. Still on the Beatles. There's a theory that Stephen King killed John Lennon. It's a guy called Steve Lightfoot in Florida who is behind this theory. He had a look at a photograph of Lennon taken on the day of his murder, where he's signing an autograph for Mark Chapman, the man who actually did murder him. And it says, if you look in the background, you'll see that the person in the photograph is not Mark Chapman having the collecting the autograph. It's actually Stephen King. And Lightfoot goes on to say that having driven around Florida in a van with a message on the sign saying that Stephen King is the worst criminal in Florida and that alleging that he murdered Lennon, his excuse is that it must be true, otherwise Stephen King would have sued me to stop me saying it. Nope, I think it just goes to prove that Stephen King is smart enough not to waste his money on lawyers' fees dealing with a loony. And then there's another one here. Oh, this is a good one. It's the 1979 cover for Supertramp's album Breakfast in America. And if you study the image, first of all, you see the New York skyline with the Twin Towers in the background, and the Statue of Liberty has been replaced with a waitress holding a glass of orange juice instead of a torch. The glass of orange juice is a bright reddy colour, and it is in front of one of the World Trade Center towers. And there's more. If you look at the record in front of a mirror, the U and P in Supertramp look like 9 and 11. So, the Twin Towers, 9/11, and Breakfast in America, because of course the attack took place at 8:45 a.m. breakfast time. And for further proof, a guy called Stanley Meesgaze, a Dutch millionaire who financed the band in the early days, has appeared in one photograph wearing a Masonic pendant. And of course, Freemasons are regularly accused of trying to bring about a new world order. Of course, it doesn't explain this theory why it took 22 years after the release of Supertramp's album, Breakfast in America, for the plot to come to fruition. I'm speechless. Next story.
You are listening to the Weird Tales Radio Show with Charles Christian on internet radio and podcast.
Time for another little delve through my casebook of paranormal encounters I've had. This one I call the case of Kitsch and Bad Karma. Back in the mid-1980s, during one of my infrequent trips back to my hometown in Scarborough, my mother asked me if I could help her with one of her women's Freemason friends who had an unlucky picture she wanted to get rid of. This was at the time. The high point was the autumn of 1985 to early 1986, when the Sun newspaper was running a series of attention-grabbing stories about the curse of the Crying Boy paintings. And both the newspaper and local fire stations around the country were being bombarded by people wanting to dispose of their Crying Boy paintings because they were believed to bring bad luck and cause fires. For a bit of background, let's step back to Middle England of the 1950s and the 1960s, just to set the context. With wartime rationing and post-war austerity now just a memory, the consumer goods revolution was getting underway. And along with washing machines and TVs, people were buying home decorations, including pictures to hang on their walls. Department stores and high street chains in the UK, such as Boots, were major purveyors of what is now called mass market art. Although they were relatively cheap reproductions, they were usually framed, glazed, and printed on a canvas effect board, so they looked like, quote-unquote, real works of art. The choice was wide, but nothing like as wide as it would be a decade later when Athena entered the market with its poster repros. But back then there were the classics such as Franz Hals' Laughing Cavalier and Constable's Hay Wain. They were the always fashionable, though personally the attraction has always escaped me, meticulously detailed reproductions of steam engines racing along railway viaducts or Spitfires dogfighting over the white cliffs of Dover. And then there was the newer stuff, not so much modern art as popular art by contemporary artists. The leader of the pack was Vladimir Trechikov. He was the artist whose Green Lady, formerly titled Chinese Girl, and his almost equally popular Miss Wong, stared down from 1 million suburban living room walls. In more recent times, Trechikov has come to be sneered at as the king of kitsch, which was how many newspapers described him after his death in 2006. But in the 50s and early 60s, he was enormously popular to the point of being a phenomenon, with his Green Lady the most widely purchased repo print in the world. For a prepubescent schoolboy like me, the raunchy gypsy women and sultry maidens of Charles Roker and J.H. Lynch, the most famous of Lynch's were Tina, Nymph, Woodland Goddess, Lisa and Tanya, held a rather more obvious attraction. But then there were the terminally creepy crying boy prints, which featured, you'll not be surprised to learn, portraits of young waifs and strays, boys and girls as it happens, with tears running down their grubby faces. There were actually at least a dozen different artists producing crying boy and crying girl paintings for mass reproduction, and coincidentally mass piracy, as most of the artists never received their full share of the royalties they should have been earning. However, the most controversial artist, and the one the Sun campaign focused, was a character called Giovanni Bragolin. Now, Bragolin, whose real name was Bruno Amadio, although most of his paintings are signed G. Bragolin, was born in Venice and initially began painting his crying boys and girls for the tourist trade in the 1950s. He continued painting until the 1970s and died at the age of 70 in 1981. Those are the facts. But facts never get in the way of a good urban legend. According to the legend, and there are several versions, Bragolin left Italy for Spain after World War II and began painting under the name of Franco Seville. While in Spain, he either painted pictures of a series of children at an orphanage who all subsequently died in a fire, or he painted a young orphan called Don Bonilio, whose parents had been killed in a house fire, and now, wherever young Bonilio stayed, mysterious fires would start. Add in the fact, again, add your own quotes, that according to the legend, Don Bonilio was himself died as a teenager when his car crashed and burst into flames, and you can see how the crying boy paintings earn their bad reputation for being unlucky and associated with fires. This, however, is only part of the story, because according to the Sun, fire brigades across England had reported dozens of cases of house fires since the 1970s, where although the buildings had been badly damaged and in some instances, quote-unquote, burned to the ground, there was always a crying boy painting present, still hanging on a wall and mysteriously undamaged by the flames. The pictures were, according to the stories, cursed or had a jinx on them. And that was just the start of the moral panic surrounding these pictures, as various self-appointed folklore experts and occult researchers popped up to say the crying children had all been abused, mistreated, or murdered by the artist, which was why they were crying, and that all these fires were a result of the children, or at least their spirits, seeking revenge. The high point, actually an all-time low, came in the late 1980s when someone claiming to be Giovanni Bragolin appeared on a Brazilian TV show to say the children appearing in his pictures were already dead when he painted them, and that he'd made a pact with the devil to sell his paintings. "If you have one of these pictures," he said, "throw it away and destroy it right now." A remarkable plea by an artist, and made all the more remarkable as by the time of his supposed television appearance, the real Bragolin was long dead. But, to get back to the mundane facts of the case, Bragolin never moved to Spain after World War II and never used the name Franco Seville, although there are plenty of fake Bragolin-type pictures out there using a variety of signatures. His models were not orphans or gypsy children. They all came from schools in and around Venice, and he openly advertised for them in local newspapers. Bragolin did not force his models to cry, either by telling them scary stories or taking their sweets from them. And in an interview in the 1970s, he said he asked them to strike a sad or neutral pose and then added the tears to the portraits at a later stage. In fact, you only have to look at the pictures to see the tears are unnaturally thick and gloopy. He also painted landscapes, still life, historical scenes, as well as sad but dry-eyed children, but none of these sold as well as his crying boys. And, as already mentioned, Bragolin was not the only artist turning out these crying boy times. Even the Sun newspaper seems to have been confused, and some of the Jinx paintings in house fires were actually those by the late Scottish portrait artist Anna Zinkstein. Handy for libel law that both artists were dead by the time of the Sun expose. But back to my mother's Freemasonry friend. Knowing I had an interest in, as my mother put it, weird stuff, which is true, my mother suggested I might be able to help, and I did. I took the picture. It was a portrait known in the UK as Alfie, laid it flat on top of a bonfire and burned it to ash. Yes, the picture was printed on some heavy gauge cardboard, and it took some time for the flames to take hold, but ultimately it was totally consumed by the fire. And this is actually the key to the mystery of the crime boy pictures apparently surviving house fires. All the brigade reports into house fires where crime boys were on premises reveal the outbreaks could be attributed to natural causes, such as chip pan fires in kitchens or carelessly discarded cigarette stubs, rather than anything supernatural. But while such fires might gut a kitchen or trash the contents of a living room, plus of course all the damage caused by the smoke and water subsequently being sprayed everywhere by the fire brigade, unless the seat of the fire was immediately beneath one of these crime boy pictures, which would obviously be hanging vertically on a wall, it would escape relatively untouched. Might be covered in smoke, might be wet, but it wouldn't be burned. Similarly, holding a cigarette lighter flame against one of these pictures would have made little impression. This was incidentally a stunt one of the newspapers did to try to prove that the pictures were somehow immune to flame. But that's just forensic fire for you. It doesn't mean they were protected by hoodoo or dark forces. As I found when I torched the picture belonging to my mother's friend, those cursed crying boy pictures were tough, but their reputed bad karma offered them no protection, paranormal or otherwise, against the flames of a well-stoked bonfire. Have you got one of those pictures and you're worried about it? Next time you're having a garden bonfire, put it on the fire, lay it flat, it'll be gone in the flames.
If you want to grow your business, save time using the latest tech, and look great online, Weird Appeal Digital can help. We have a free, yes, that's free download listing 40 digital tools, apps and resources to help you grow your brand, promote your project, generate leads and reach your audience. Just go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales for smart, effective digital design, and your free download, go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales.
Almost time to go again. However, before we go, one last story. And as you know, we carry quite a lot of stories here, items about folklore and events and customs at a time immemorial, going back to pagan times. Or do they? Here's a little bit of research I spotted in a book by Ronald Hutton, Professor Ronald Hutton, the well-known UK expert on Wicca and paganism. It's some notes he found about a village called Mere in Wiltshire. And back in 1565, they instituted an arrangement whereby a cuckoo king presided over the annual parish feast with a prince to assist him, who would become next year's monarch. This idea of lords of misrule and kings of festivals is another area of folklore we'll go into another time. Anyway, this started in 1565. It lapsed in 1573, so that's just 8 years later. Was revived in 1576, so we're just another 3 years on. And in 1577, it was described as being performed according to ye olde custom. So in other words, just 12 years and 9 performances could be sufficient to give a ritual the reputation of antiquity in Elizabethan England, which of course raises the issue that many of the ancient practices and pieces of folklore recorded by 19th century scholars may have been comparatively recent inventions. Anyway, Janie and I look forward to you joining us again next time, but till then, may your gods and goddesses protect you from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist.icloud.com or on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.